Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Kamini, and I'm your host for today. My guest today is Dr. Simon Longstaff. He's a philosopher trained at Cambridge and an officer of the Order of Australia. Simon works with CEOs, boards, and government leaders on questions of ethics, human flourishing, and what it means to make decisions that are good and right. He's an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales Business School and an honorary professor at the Australian National University. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much, Kamini.
Simon, you recently wrote an article titled AI and Rediscovering Our Humanity, where you reference Francis Bacon's 1620 vision that science would give humans dominion over nature and free us from the sweat of our brows. 400 years later, AI might finally be delivering on that promise. So let me start with a deliberately provocative question. Will AI make us more human, or will it finally reveal what being human actually means?
Well, let's go back to Francis Bacon because there was a slightly unsettling component to his vision, which is that not only did he think we would have dominion over nature, as in something other and different to ourselves, but he also anticipated that we would have dominion over ourselves. That is, the science of man would come into focus, and that we may very well find ways through science to, if you like, tame our animal natures, to make good, if you like, the loss that he believed within his theological perspective of the time, the loss that came from being cast out from the Garden of Eden. So it was a pretty broad view of it, and potentially chilling in its extension, because in a sense, it could eliminate a number of the elements that make us human: the whimsy, the imagination, the capacity for surprise and delight, the creative spirit, which sometimes chafes against the regulations and orderly structures of society. So I think that the, the technology, the stacks of technology that make up AI, are very likely to see efficiencies and even improvements in effectiveness in many, many tasks that humans perform. The interesting question, which I tried to get to in that article, is saying, well, if that's true, and if we assume that capitalism, at least which is dominant in the country where I live, will, by its very inclination, embrace this technology because it saves money and time, then what is it that it won't be able to do? In other words, what is distinctive of a form of being in which we participate, that is human being, which we will need to recognise and preserve and hopefully value?
Simon, I understand you are referencing um, Francis Bacon's vision that science would give humans dominion over nature, and understand it came from a theological perspective. But your personal opinion, when I think about technology and making us more human, it's in the context of us freeing ourselves from the mundane nature of having to work, having to work to earn a living in order to have the lives that we have that are fundamentally human in nature, our relationships, our our appreciation of arts and science, and the artistic side of being a human being. I think that's what I'm trying to articulate. I think it's.
Mm.
Do you perceive it to be an utopian vision, or are we getting nearer to that?
No, I think it's reasonably likely that we will deploy technology which alleviates people from the burden in which they have to struggle through life doing dirty, dangerous work or very boring work. But I'm not sure that the elimination of those things in order to pursue, say, artistic endeavours is necessarily going to be the thing which we discover which is most significant about being human. But let me put it to you, a positive view of it, that as far as we know, of all the creatures on this planet, some of which build beautiful things and have wonderful bird songs, so they're creative beings in their world. We can't pierce their mind, but what we don't think they're capable of doing is transcending their animal nature, that is, the instincts and desires that drive them through life. What we do know of human beings is that we are capable of going beyond our animal nature because we clearly have animals. We're driven by instincts and we're driven by desires. But let's imagine a lion on the veldt somewhere in South Africa hunting an impala. Does the lion stop and say to itself, "Oh, gosh, I'm hungry, but what about its children?" I think probably not. I think more likely thing is that a lion will catch the impala, kill it, and eat it. Whereas there are human beings at this very moment when we are speaking who are starving, who can see some food before them, and who will not take it, not because anyone's going to stop them, but because they say, it's not mine. And there are people who are in places like Ukraine where they're facing terrible danger, where every instinct might be to run away, to flee from the danger. And they're not protecting their families or their own property. They stay steadfast merely because they made a promise that they would do so. In other words, an entirely abstract thing. So the remarkable thing about humans, whether this is a product of nature or some people want to offer a religious explanation, is that we are, yes, very much within our animal nature, but we're not bound or limited by it. And therefore, when it comes to things that distinguish us from AI, you start to see certain important differences. So AI systems may be, in fact, they already are, more competent at diagnosing certain forms of cancer. They'll be as accurate, if not more accurate, than any human being. But only another human being can put their hand on your shoulder with a consoling touch when they need to tell you the very bad news that you're going to die. And what you know is that as they tell you that, they know what it means to be mortal. They understand that they're going to tell you something which could be quite terrifying. That is, that within perhaps months or weeks, you are going to die. Now, an AI system may be able to do a very competent simulation of that. It may have the words right. It may have the tone of voice right. It may even, when twinned with robotics, even have what seems to be the touch right, which is gentle and concerning and all the rest. It may be an identical replica. But the thing that we will know is that it is only a simulation of those things. It does not actually know and understand what it means to be mortal. And you can extend that out to care, the way we care for each other, and what it means to understand the frailties of the human condition. You could extend it into art with the ability to imagine different worlds and to place ourselves within them in a way where we have this embodied experience of what it's like. We can feel the emotions. All of those things are distinctive. So, yes, the first step is the liberation from the drudgery of life, but we've been there before. This is not a new idea. There are civilizations that have existed with the pernicious institution of slavery, where all of the dirty, dangerous work were done by, albeit other human beings who were not accorded full personhood. So that's not the magic source in this, because we've had societies which have had that without realizing the distinctive elements of their humanity. It's this other kind of understanding of what it means to be this kind of creature that I think will be the thing that emerges, or needs to emerge at least. Whether it happens or not is a different question.
Just getting back to our animal instinct or nature, Simon,
Mm.
I've always expressed my understanding when doing workshops and things like that. I've always expressed my understanding of ethics by placing it in the context of a survival strategy. So we've been on the planet for 300,000 years, Homo sapiens. We began to form tribes because of safety in numbers and to preserve that harmony within the tribe. We kicked out people who exhibited antisocial behavior. So much of which is codified today, part of common law, or described as criminal behavior. So, what gives me hope for that, getting over our animal nature and instinct, is that Homo sapiens have been, depending on what you believe, but been on the planet for 300,000. years, in the past 100 years, we've advanced exponentially in terms of our ethical advancement as societies. So, whether it's human rights, women's rights, farm animals, slavery, and a host of other issues. So, that gives me hope. And I used to be very, very optimistic, but this was prior to COVID.
Hmm.
And so I was optimistic when it came to this ethical revolution that we are having in our societies. But then COVID hit. And we know what happens with there's scarcity, ethics goes out the window. And that's exactly what happened in terms of our vaccine distribution. So, for example, the UK bought 400 million doses of the various vaccines, never mind the rest of the planet. And that's just one example. So, my question is behaving ethically is easy when there's abundance, and it becomes less so in times of scarcity. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Well, there's so much in what you said. Firstly, yes, one can explain the emergence of, uh, I wouldn't say so much ethics, but morality, and I'll explain what I mean by the difference, uh, as part of the evolutionary pattern of human society in order to bring about some kind of measurement and control. And other means which were often wedded to this included things like religion, where again could be used as a mechanism for social control. The difference just between ethics and morality for a moment is that each morality that's available, and there are many different types carrying different labels, they all perform a similar function, which is namely to provide an answer to the question, what should I do? Or what should one do? So whenever you've got a choice or decision, from the moment you're born, if you like, you're inducted into a certain framework for answering that question by your parents and by your community. So there's a Christian morality, a Hindu morality, a Jain morality, an Islamic morality, and so on and so forth. And there are philosophical varieties. The thing about living a moral life, it's perfectly possible to do so merely as a matter of habit. You can be habituated by that experience so that whenever you are asked the question or ask yourself, what should I do? You go to the little box you've been given and you say, that's what happens, and habitually you apply that. Now, the difference, a critical difference about ethics is that it's based on an examined life. It's even if you are habitually virtuous in that you're habitually kind or truthful, this is a great achievement for a society, but it's a lesser achievement for a person because ethics requires this examination. And in the process of that examination, one of the things you might start to ask is, well, who counts? So one of the big fluctuations that takes place throughout history is how people respond to that question about who counts. So if you look at, say, the founders of the Republic in the United States of America, people like Thomas Jefferson, he'll tell you that, of course, he'll speak about the rights of man and, freedom, and he'll talk about the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. And he'll expect that his fair-haired children will never be subjected to the kind of restraint that he also accepts it applies to people like his own children from Sally Hemings, who are African American heritage. And you say to him, well, why is the difference? And he says, well, if he's honest, he says, those black people are not fully human. In fact, in the United States, they accorded a ratio of 4/7 of a person was a person who was a slave, an African American. They actually gave a number. Now, you can look at this and apply it in other ways. Some people have said, well, women, they're not fully human, they've got many of the attributes, but there's deficient. Or people of a different religion, they're not fully part of us. So this ability to divide the world into those who are like us and who belong and should enjoy full consideration, and those who are on the outside, that's the major fluctuation. The consistent view would be, oh, of course, persons should not, people shouldn't be enslaved, and of course, they should be treated with dignity, but they're not really part of that group. So the evolution we've seen over the last few years in a number of societies has seen an extension, a broadening of who actually counts, so that perhaps in a way that's quite distinctive, many people who were once excluded are now included. Now, how robust is that in the face of scarcity, which is really your question? I mean, are we prepared to recognise the full and equal personhood of every human being, even when there are limited goods to be provided? The answer is everybody should, because the concept which comes from probably one of the best expressions of it is caught by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who talks about the kingdom of ends. That is, we all have this intrinsic dignity. We all have that personhood. On that basis, you should say everybody should be equally treated, or at least they should be treated with justice. And that, well, we might talk about that in a moment. But in practice, there are many people who will say, oh, my obligation is first of all to look after my own family, or those who live in my street or community. And if there's a general obligation, it's not standing in an equal position for the strangers in the world as it is for those who are with me. And they're not necessarily rationalizing selfishness on this basis. They may actually believe this to be true, but there's a kind of expanding series of circles where the obligations are tighter, more complete, the closer they are to the person you are, like your own children, your own family, and so forth. Of course, there's a radically different view about this too, which says actually, no, the stranger who is in conditions of deprivation has a stronger claim to make against you in your relative position of affluence than your own relatively affluent children and own relatively affluent community. But that's the tension, and we see it expressed in politics as well as in life, between who we can think counts and what claim they reasonably make upon us. And you see that being acted out during the course of COVID.
I like your reference to personhood because that just reminds me about something that's, I'm not sure when they implemented the law, but it's in Sweden. You know, when you're talking, I like to talk about our ethical evolution, or is it a revolution? I'm not sure. And we're talking about in the context of personhood, but I think our consciousness is expanding to sentient beings as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Sweden that says dogs cannot be left alone for more than 6 hours without a human or canine contact. I mean, how fantastic is that? In the space of 100 years, we've evolved from slavery to saying our canine companion should not be left because it's cruel, because they are sentient beings. And it
Well, there are
just,
some cultures that go a lot further than that. There are some cultures that will accord a significant ethical status to gnats and ants and any form of life. There are
mhm.
some cultures, such as that which exists in my country of Australia, the oldest continuous living culture, 65,000 years, where the indigenous people actually accord ethical significance to everything that is rocks, plants, animals, the sky. Uh, and it's an entirely comprehensive system based on relationships where everybody and everything is related each to the other. So, yes, we have made a bit of progress in the West, getting from white males to everybody else and now even sentient beings. But we may also be a fair way off where we could go if you wanted to have a more radical thought about what takes on ethical significance in the world.
I like your reference to sovereign knowledge or indigenous knowledge ecosystems. I
Mm,
spoke a couple of weeks ago to Michael Bach from Thailand, and he's a policy and digital rights professional. And he made, and it's the first time I had an in depth conversation with somebody about indigenous knowledge systems. And he says,
mm.
yes, in terms of the way we are framing our AI ethics frameworks, why are we not including sovereign knowledge ecosystems like indigenous, like your First Nations people in Australia,
Mm.
like Ubuntu in South Africa, and throughout the world we have these things that are, I'm not an expert, but it appears that that whole the idea that's central to all of them is harmony with ourselves, with the natural world, and a state
Mm.
of balance. And you know, I think we've kind of forgotten those profound truths about how we are supposed to live.
That's right. There's some very deep truths, and it's a kind of truth that confronts many of our assumptions. So, for example, you just take a simple debate in AI ethics about consent and privacy and things. Most of it is framed in individualistic terms. The individual person is ultimately able to decide questions about what data they provide, how it's used, and so forth. But in many Indigenous worldviews, consent actually has not only an individual, but equally and perhaps sometimes more importantly, a communal component where the whole of the mob have to decide. And it'll be provisional because if things change in the attitude of the group as to what they think is appropriate, they expect the world to change in response to that alteration in their expectations. So there are some quite deep differences about how one might think about this. But there's also something that I think is a very deep philosophical question, which I'm only tentatively advancing here, but I think it may be worth exploring about the difference between two types of world, and that is the world of the analog and the world of the digital. Now, human beings like us, we live within and experience an analog world. So if one ever encounters a sine wave, that very pure sound, that sine wave will be absolutely perfect in the way it curves, that shape that it makes. If you encounter a digital version of it, it will be made up of bits and therefore it will have edges and there'll be little edges. Now you can go to a level of refinement in a digital sine wave so that the edge is entirely indistinguishable. You can't hear it. You can't, that jagged thing is the, it's such a highly fine device. But because of the way that asymptotes work, that is, these things which, like in graphs, always approach the edge but never quite reach them. A digital sine wave will never be as perfect and can never be as perfect as an analog sine wave. There'll always be something, even if it's infinitesimally small, that will be missing. Now, that raises some very interesting questions about AI, which lives in the digital world, and its relationship to us and all the things we engage with in the analog world. And again, is there something about our intuition about that analog world and the relationships that exist between things, which is captured, for example, in Indigenous knowledge systems, which is simply not able to be discerned or perceived adequately by something living in a digital environment, such as an AI system, no matter how expert it is. So again, there may be a gap, and it may seem to many people to be inconsequential, but nonetheless, possibly it is. It's a thing to wonder about as to whether or not those older systems caught something about the nature of our existence, which is distinctive and simply cannot be replicated by the digital system, no matter how clever it is.
Simon, I must confess that entire digital analog thing that you described now it went completely over my head. Can you break it down for me, perhaps?
Yeah. So have you ever seen a pure sine wave, what's called a sine wave? It's got a shape, which I'm trying to draw on the screen, that goes like that.
Mm.
Okay. Now, in the analog world where it's produced, there are no edges to it. It's entirely smooth. It's a perfect curve, if you like. Now, let's suppose I want to make a copy of it, but a digital copy. So how do I make something out of a digital world? I make it out of bits. So a bit, a 1 or a 0 or whatever it is, no matter what it is, has got, when you put it together, it's got little edges to it. So no matter how fine you go down, there's always a little bit of an edge. It's not a perfect curve. It's a series of edges which are smoothed to look as if and get as close as they can to the perfect edge. The difference between perfect smooth and the very fine edge is information. There's information in the analog world which is largely but not completely captured in the digital world. And the question is, does that matter? That little bit of information that's lost. Now, I suspect that Indigenous experiences, which are based in the world and relationships and things like that, have got some of their fullness by the fact that that's where they've arisen, in that space, the analog space. And I'm just questioning, as a kind of a philosophical conundrum, really, as to whether or not AI will ever fully be useful to us. In other words, it can't quite replicate what it means to be human because it lives in a different kind of world than we do, the digital versus the analog. Is that clearer?
So what you're saying is that the sum of the parts make up the whole, and in digital, it's those sharp bits that result in the spaces between the information, and that is represented in the analog world by what
Yeah. Because
indigenous knowledge systems brings into it.
not
So if
just that, it could, it's a hypothesis that maybe they're better tuned to this,
well,
but it's, if you talk to audiophiles, okay, people who love music, they still say that when they listen to a vinyl recording of, say, an instrument, that because it is an analog recording, there is something different than even the finest digital recording. They claim to be able to hear something that's not in the digital recording. There are people who, does that make sense to you?
I think I'm getting it. So you are basically talking about cracked pots. You're talking about that Japanese concept of uh, cracked pots, and they put in the gold fillings and whatever and make the pot whole. But the beauty
Mm-hmm.
lies in its imperfection. Is that what you're
Not,
saying?
that could be part of that, but what I'm trying to make it is to think about what you take for granted every day, which is that you live in an analog world where everything you experience comes to you through your touch, and or you're not, there's not a digital interface in your actual experience of the world. And the question is, if you, oh, let me put it this way. Let's suppose I said, I'm going to get you to take a photograph of the sky with a, where there's the sky itself with its array of light and all the rest, and then you take a digital photograph. Will that be a perfect replication of what's there? The answer is it cannot be perfect because it's got pixels, and pixels have edges. Now, they may not be discernible to the human eye, but nonetheless, they exist in a way that when you look at the sky, there are no pixels. It's just a complete smooth sky with clouds or whatever it is that you happen to see. I don't want to dwell too much on this because it's probably a distraction from what you want to talk about. It's just an interesting question when you start to think about how far AI can go. I mean, to put it this way, in its simplest form, I might ask, what limitations might AI ultimately experience because it exists in a world which is digital, whereas we live in an analog world?
Okay, thanks for that, Sam. You've given me something to think about, because when I think about, you mentioned, going back to your point about giving human comfort, and the doctor's touch and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I always thought, that is true because there's something real about it. But then again, reality is depending on the lens that you use. So, for example, now there appears to be a problem. There was an article a couple of weeks ago, sorry, and it was talking about groups of or youngsters are now finding or now interacting more with their AI bots and companions than in real life.
Mm.
And prior to this, I'm going all over the place, but prior to this, I had a student in one of my classes, Ethics in AI, from Canada, and he was a computer scientist, and his wife passed away about 3 years prior to that. And he created, this is long before it's become ubiquitous, he created a companion and he downloaded his wife's voice and whatever. And at that point in time, this is 3 years ago, I was appalled. I was totally appalled at this. You are creating a synthetic presence and you are conflating it to that very special relationship you had. But now I view it in a different light. What is so bad about having AI companions? We are increasingly in a world where people are lonely, they are it's society is becoming fragmented, and this provides a measure of comfort to people. What's so bad about it?
Well, there's nothing especially bad about it in this, as long as you don't think that it's actually, for example, the wife that had died or the person. But let me ask you, let's suppose you are a small child and you stumble in the street, you graze your knee, and either the mother who loves you unconditionally can come out, pick you up in her arms and cuddle you, or a robot who looks like your mother and feels just as soft and tender comes out and picks you up and cuddles you. Who do you want? What's the difference in that? And the difference is in the love that the mother provides to you, not as a function of a program, not as a simulation of that. Now, in a world where people are lonely, you might say a second best option is to have an online friend who replays to you uh, all the things that it thinks you want. Noting, of course, that there has been a recent case in the United States where one of these companions, it is alleged, drove a young person to suicide. Okay, so they're not necessarily always benign in their effect, whatever their non-intention might be. But I just think there is something fundamentally different between the care and concern of a mother for their child and that which a robot offers, or an actual friend who can talk to you and who can truly feel empathy for what you say, as opposed to a system which is performing empathy token by token using just a predictive structure in order to serve up the next word that comes after that word that comes after that word, which is not feeling anything. It isn't actually thinking anything. It's just using an algorithm to assemble tokens. I'd say, well, let's at least address the possibility that in a world, let's say, where we don't spend our time engaged in meaningless work or drudgery or carrying terrible burdens, maybe the time that releases could be to actually have friends. One of the great things about friends is that you can have as many friends as you like without ever denying another person an equal number. It's not like friendships are kind of a common good. You know, if you have lollies in a jar and there's 100 of them, if somebody takes 99, that just leaves one for you. If you walk into a room with 100 people and you make friends with 99 of them, so can somebody else. I mean, it's not gobbled up. It can be, it can be a universal access to that kind of thing. And so perhaps when we start to value those things, and there's plenty to go around because it's infinitely divisible, then maybe that's what we'll use our spare time for things like that, rather than having to put the load on lonely people in darkened rooms talking to artificial systems.
On the one hand, I absolutely agree with your point that, human interaction trumps uh, a synthetic relationship. But on the other hand, I also note that people are having more and more of these synthetic interactions because it's easier. We will take
Yeah,
the
I don't
path
push
of
back.
somebody who doesn't argue with you, who agrees with everything that you say, that you don't need to work on it, and actually loves you and validates you at every second. And
It
we are
doesn't love you
not
at all.
that well. We are not deep enough, at least most of us, to say, I am absolutely positive that I can keep my boundaries with this synthetic um, technology, because as human beings, it's not about the technology, it's who we are as human beings. We are inherently emotional social creatures, I think. And
Yeah,
that colors our relationship with whoever. So whether we start treating our dogs as fur babies, whether we start treating our AI companions as, oh, that's my boyfriend, or whatever the case is, I think maybe the problem is not with the technology, it's with human beings, because we are, however you see it, incapable of being rational about this technology.
well, firstly, it's not going to actually love you. Uh,
No,
well,
no, I get that. I get
whereas
it.
whereas a dog actually can,
Mm.
certainly has affection. Look, if you were a 13-year-old boy engaging with some kind of synthetic being that never ever challenges you, never questions you, never does any of the things which sometimes we find a bit painful. And you will probably stay a 13-year-old boy for the whole of your life, because the point about maturing into an adult person is that it involves encountering difficulty, being challenged, and all the rest. Now, this is then a challenge for technologists, because when you create any kind of technology, you also create certain defined affordances, that is, things you can do with it, some of which are known and some of which ought to be anticipated and some which might fall outside your ability to predict it. So let's suppose you're building a synthetic companion, and one of the questions is, well, should you think about the use case of a 13-year-old boy who sits there in a room engaging with this, or even if they're doing it when they're moving around with their devices, whatever. And their experience of this is such that they can never grow up, because it's constantly reinforcing all the things they are today and telling them how wonderful they are. Do you think, as a technologist, knowing that tendency within human beings, that you should create such an affordance? Or are you, as a responsible creator of technology, required to understand something of that tendency within this 13-year-old boy and not create that affordance? In other words, you build it so that it doesn't spend its time actually saying you're the best thing, stay where you are, never change, you're perfect as you are, and all the rest of it. So yes, we as humans are responsible for our choices. Yes, we have certain dispositions through our emotional and other states. But equally, the people who create these technologies have got certain responsibilities in terms of the affordances they create in the light of that knowledge. And I think it's a dual responsibility. It's not just one or the other. I think both parties have a responsibility for getting that right.
I think in a perfect world, we can have, I absolutely totally agree with you, but of course I agree with you. But the reality is, if we continue to bow at the altar of capitalism, we will never have uh, that ethical imperative to do the right thing. Because, I mean, I'm talking now from a global north perspective. The fact that you can go to the global south and test your technologies out, the fact that in the US it's reached such a state of fragmentation that nobody's having the big conversations about misinformation and disinformation and echo chambers to the extent to which your society is deeply distrustful, and I don't know what's happening there. I don't know why people are not having a conversation. Another thing that I used to also tell people about in my workshops is make reference to the World Happiness Report, where the top 25 happiest countries in the world, and every single one of them, high trust societies are happier societies. Where we
Yeah,
trust each other more, we will be happier. And yet, we have AI that is causing more fragmentation at a greater rate than ever before.
that's right. And you're right. It's not just that you'll be a happier society, you'll be a more prosperous society. We've known since the dawn of economics that high trust equals low cost. If you can enter into an agreement, have a handshake, and honour your word, that's a very inexpensive way to make agreements. If someone breaks their word, you might deal with them again, but you're going to have a whole lot of enforcement provisions, contracts, and other things, and that becomes a lot more expensive. But you mentioned capitalism. There's two possible versions of capitalism which are out there. There's the version of Adam Smith, and there's the version that Karl Marx criticises. Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, and he's the one who comes up with the idea of the free market. What people forget is that although he does license the pursuit of self-interest and says that it's not due to love of others that the butcher, the brewer, or the baker make provision for our dinner, he does say that the system should inevitably, in his view, through the action of the invisible hand, increase the stock of common good. In other words, market should make us all better off. That's the first thing he says. And if they don't, then they're not fulfilling their function. The second thing that comes from Adam Smith is that although he says But the reason we might trade and do other things is through self-interest. How we do it has to be bound by certain ethical norms. You cannot have a free market if you lie, if you cheat, if you use power oppressively. Nor can you operate them if you don't have what he calls sympathy and reciprocity, which he talks about not in The Wealth of Nations so much as a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, Marx's criticism of capitalism, which is pretty much the one you just described, is that it has none of those ethical restraints. It's not about free market. It's about domination. It's about pursuing the ends at any cost, which is namely profit, and that eventually he, in his view, thinks it will drive itself into the ground and it will be replaced by something else. He may turn out to be right in the long term, but not so far. But he was also a great champion of capitalism as a massive engine to improve the conditions of people in the first instance. But again, he had this idea: we have to all be better off from it before it breaks down and consumes too much of the things. The point about all this is that it is not inevitable that a system of free markets which employs technology must necessarily be greedy and rapacious. It doesn't inevitably have to be at the expense of people in the global south. It doesn't have to be a system which operates without any regard for justice for all persons. Those are choices that we can make. And there's nothing about the structure of markets or anything else that necessarily leads to those pernicious outcomes. So we could decide in countries which have got sufficient affluence and sufficient institutional arrangements like the rule of law to say, actually, we're going to pass laws that say that if you create a system which is used in that way, then you're going to be held accountable. And there'll be some kind of retribution for those who do that. So again, it's part of that ability to create not just the technology, but the system within which it sits that can help to address some of the potential failings that come about. And yes, there'll be people who say, oh, no, we don't want any regulation. We just want to be able to do whatever we have. But I think we might say, even from the earliest conception of capitalism, that there actually is a common good to be protected in relation to its operation.
Simon, do you think that we're talking about Francis Bacon in the context of the age of enlightenment?
Hmm.
Can I say that we are in the age of counter enlightenment, where there's a rejection of reason, progress, secularism? One thing I cannot understand is this is the zenith of our progress as humanity, but the growing climate of anti-intellectualism, I don't understand that. And
Oh, I think, yeah, yeah.
what are your comments on that?
Well, firstly, I think that the Enlightenment, for all of its virtues, also had a vicious side. It's the kind of calculative rationality it gave rise to. You see it expressed in its almost perfect form in something like Nazi Germany,
Okay.
where Fritz Lang's vision, if you go back to his film Metropolis and you look at the film he created where human beings are basically being used literally to fuel the machine, the rise of artificial intelligence in an embodied form, you see that being acted out in the Third Reich. So the 20th century not only produced, or the Enlightenment didn't only produce human rights, for example, where it's this expanding circle we talked about, which accords and recognises personhood for all, it also produced some pretty terrible things. So there is a reaction against it, and what's being reacted against are the better parts of being torn down. So the idea of universal human rights is being challenged by a certain kind of identity politics that says, actually, don't treat me as if I belong to a common human group. You must see me in a particularity, and I will claim certain rights in this very particular sense, which are the anti-science move and the questioning of its ability to bring about, as best we can, the truth about the world and use it. That's being torn down. Now, do I despair at that? Well, no, because I think this is my optimistic side speaking. I think it's possible that we're moving through a transition which is just as profound as that which occurred before the Enlightenment. So there's a period when the old world of religion and superstition and all of its dominant forms gives way to the emergence of the Enlightenment. And the person who is laying down the typeface to print the books of Bacon and Descartes and people like that, they have no idea that they are actually changing the world. That once those books are published, they'll spread out. And I wonder, are we passing through another phase now where it is so profound and so uncomfortable, but that's because we don't know where it ends up. And in my more optimistic side, I think maybe something which might be a reintegration of some of those indigenous forms of knowledge back with the best in the Enlightenment and say we might discover that more holistic view. Perhaps that's where we're heading when I think in my optimistic view. And it's just incredibly painful at the moment. Now, I think our challenge is to preserve that possibility without destroying it along the way by the affordances we create. But I do have that optimistic sense that that might be what's happening.
I tend to agree with you because, as we know from history, we go in cycles, and perhaps this is just another cycle, and we're in the extremely painful but here, and
Mm.
it's not a time for despair, it's rather a time to say, we are that um, butterfly or that caterpillar striving
Yeah, the
to.
chrysalis.
Yes,
Mm.
yes, trying to sort itself out and going through this agonizing change, but at the end of it, it's going to be beautiful. So perhaps we are there. I just despair. I shouldn't despair, but how low can we go? When I see, for example, which is, maybe out of the scope of this discussion, but when I see, like, for example, in the US, in terms of the rule of law, in terms of bringing in the military to civilian cities, their own cities, it affects me profoundly.
Oh, but we know from the 20th century we can go very low. In fact, we know from pretty much every century how low we can go. There's been deplorable conduct by human beings against each other, creating systems. But, history tells us too that we are capable of rejecting that. I mean, the combined effort of the democracies against the fascist powers led to success and peace for a period of time. Not a perfect kind of peace, wasn't a completely just world. But if you look at all of the evidence from the end of the 19th century onwards, there is less violence in the world today. There is less poverty. Um, Things have actually objectively been getting better. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get worse, but the trajectory has so far been to diminish poverty and I mean, the achievements of the Chinese government alone in terms of reducing poverty in that vast country. But it goes on and on. So history gives us as many lessons which should underpin our optimism as our pessimism about what we're capable of. Remembering always that there is nothing inevitable about what's, say, occurring, you mentioned in the United States, or that it's not as if there's something that's just unfolding and there's nothing we can do about it. People can make choices. And I think that the sad thing often is that it's not so much that individuals around the world are powerless, it's rather that we believe ourselves to be powerless. And yet we know, again, from history that when people make just very small decisions, just tiny ones to fall on the right side of any question, then the aggregated effect of that can change the world. In other words, we don't all have to be a Gandhi or a Mandela to change the world, nor do we have to be a technological genius to bring AI to a point where it becomes a tool in the service of our humanity. Lots of little people saying, that's what I want, that's what I expect, and withholding their warrant if that's not done, particularly within the democracies, that can have an effect if enough people want to make that choice. It's just not giving way to despair, which is the first step.
So, okay, I'm going to reframe this. We uh, at the cusp of the golden age. Uh,
Hopefully. We may be, hopefully.
Uh, but if anything has shown us from history, our ability to survive and thrive, despite the worst conditions, is what puts us at the top of the food chain. Um, And hopefully, we can look forward to an age of enlightenment, and we can call it the golden age. But for leaders, if you could speak directly to business and political leaders right now, what is the one ethical imperative they need to understand about this AI transition?
Firstly, that they need to insist that the ethical considerations are there at the point of design. Secondly, that those who design these systems must be able to give an account of what they have created to a disinterested third party, in which they are able to show how the core values and principles that they have drawn on are embedded in the system and preserved in it. And the third thing is, wherever you foresee a material risk from that system, it should not be allowed into the world until it has passed the same kind of test that you have for pharmaceuticals, namely that it must be safe and effective. I'd say if you're a leader and you do those three things, set up the system for how it's designed, how it can be assured, and how it's released, then yes, there may be a little bit of sand in the wheels of progress, but nothing in that says it has to be bland or conforming. It just needs to say you need to think about it and tell us what it's supposed to do and how it does it, so that we can have confidence that you're not creating affordances which are destructive to the overall well-being of society.
For citizens, what can
Yeah.
ordinary people do to engage with these questions meaningfully? And how do we think about work, purpose, and meaning in our lives as the shift unfolds? You talked about those little things we can do to eventually ensure a better outcome. What does that look like?
It's hard to speak to citizens of every country in the world because the
Sure.
political systems vary so much. But for those in the democracy, firstly, you need to get used to the idea that there's a difference between work and jobs. Through millennia, people have done work, for example, women in homes and all sorts of things, but they never had a job. They weren't employed by anyone and the rest. Yet the work they did was incredibly meaningful. So that's the first thing. Start getting used to the idea that there's a difference between doing good work and having a job. Secondly, you need to get your governments to start to be honest with you about what they're going to do when you start to see the major displacement, even if it's transitional, but there will be a displacement of many people from the jobs that they have at the moment. And many of those people will not have been affected in the past because this time the AI systems and their associated technologies will be displacing middle class jobs in accounting, in banking, in finance, and all sorts of things. So, what is it you as a citizen can offer in terms of meaningful work, even if you don't have a job? How is your government preparing your society for that? And how is it going to pay for this? What will be the alternative sources of taxation that will allow a society to flourish? For example, will government tax the means of production? And how will that be redistributed so that you can survive while doing the work that you do in the time perhaps where the transition takes place? So it's about having your eyes open as a citizen. It's about challenging your government to explain how this transition is going to occur, given the animal spirits of capitalism, particularly in its most rampant, will be driving this as fast as it possibly can. Those are the sorts of things you do, and you should be preparing to assert what it is about you as a human that is distinctive and valuable that no machine can do.
Simon, what keeps you up at night after 34 years studying ethics and human flourishing? What keeps you up at night about the current trajectory of AI and automation?
The thing that worries me most is that the societies in which we live are not preparing, and certainly not being open in their preparations for the major transition that will take place. I think everything from our taxation systems to the level of employment, the structure of our suburbs where we live if you're in cities, or the access to goods in rural and regional communities around the world. I just don't see those things being discussed. I mean, people talk about AI safety and, autonomous robots and all those things, but the broader social implications, even in the most benign looking outlook, I don't think we're doing that. So that keeps me awake because I think when societies are profoundly challenged, uh, they can easily go wrong very quickly when people get angry and frustrated and scared. And I think we need more comprehensive leadership from governments and from those who run corporations and all the rest about what's coming and how they're preparing and helping us to prepare for that.
On the flip side, what gives you hope? What developments or trends suggest we might actually achieve something closer to the ethical Eden rather just a technological one?
Well, the most hope comes from younger people, in that I think they really they understand the world is not a just world for them, even if they're in the global north. They're struggling to afford to buy houses and things, and I think they're looking for meaning in what they do, as well as they want to live well, but they also want to live well in the sense of a good, meaningful life. And I think they'll be the kind of consumers that demand something more from the manufacturers of these expert systems and the gadgets to which they attach. So that's a source for me of optimism. I also think it's not beyond the makers of technology to do so in a responsible manner. In other words, if I thought it was impossible for them to do it, then I'd be somewhat despondent. But they could if only they chose to do so. So I know they can do it because and that is, they can do better than they're doing at the moment. My kind of in between position about this is, will they make that choice, and do the structures we as a society create within which they operate demand that they make that choice?
I agree with you. We're talking about China, and I think that the rate of absolute poverty is below 1% now, and it was done over a period of 20 years that they've
Mm.
lowered the poverty rate. But it comes down to this simple thing: intentionality. And in terms of ethical AI, in terms of the societies that we want to create or want to, in our small ways, through our actions, add to or contribute to, it comes down to intentionality. Thank you so much, Simon. Where can people find your work and follow the Ethics Center's activities?
Probably the simplest way is just to go to our website, which is www.ethics.org.au.
Thank you for your time and profound insight, Simon. This has been exactly the kind of philosophical conversation we need right now. Not about what AI can do, but about who we are and who we might become. I am grateful for sharing your wisdom and thank you very much.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for the invitation to join you today.